one more speaker, which is my honor to present. Alyy Patel is a trailblazing LGBTQ plus researcher, writer, activist, and influencer who has made monumental strides for the queer South Asian women. Alyy pioneered Canadian research on queer South Asian women's issues and founded the Queer South Asian Women's Network, a thriving national organization. Alyy is a Toronto-based, gay, gender-fluid Gujarati, on a mission to foster inclusivity by influencing worldviews, bridging community gaps, and inspiring others to lead with love. It's my pleasure to introduce.
Hello, my name is Alyy Patel, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Queer South Asian Women's Network. Like many other queer South Asians, I grew up thinking I was the only queer brown woman ever, because LGBTQ plus representation was, and still is, heavily Western normative and advances a stereotype that only white people can be queer. This made me feel really alone navigating my sexual orientation at a young age. I ventured into queer spaces in my adolescence when it became possible to quote-unquote live a double life. I was, and still am, constantly heterosexualized by my white counterparts due to the colonial understandings of what a lesbian looks like. For years, this had turned the pride for my South Asian roots into shame and pressured me into assimilating in order to be credible for my queer identity. I was desperate to feel a sense of belonging within the LGBTQ plus community, so I tried to assimilate. However, I continued to experience racially charged microaggressions within the queer community, as I was unable to fully disassociate from my South Asianness without being exiled from the Gujarati community. The inability to be queer in culturally conducive ways is extremely invalidating, invisibilizing, and infuriating. And that is why I passionately advocate for queer South Asian visibility. I'm beyond honored to be the first queer South Asian woman to speak at Ontario's Pride flag raising ceremony, and very happy to be back because I worked 2 summers in the OPS. As a South Asian, I have additional battles in my fight for sexual liberation. As a queer person, I need to fight for acceptance in heterosexual society. As a queer woman-presenting individual, I need to fight for space in the male-dominant LGBTQ plus community. But as a queer South Asian woman, along with our fellow queer East Asian, Southeast Asian, Pacific Islander, Hispanic, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, we need to fight for both our ethnic and sexual identities to coexist within queer spaces. The constant pressure to choose between being either queer or a person of color makes it incredibly difficult to celebrate our authentic selves, which, after all, is the center point of Pride festivities. Pride Month is a beautiful time of joy, love, and liberation. However, for many queer South Asians, it's also a time of profound grief and loneliness. This is because the pride that we celebrate here in Ontario and Canada more broadly continues to erase the existence of queer South Asian people in the diaspora. So some of you may know this, but sexual and gender fluidity was widely accepted and considered normal in pre-colonial South Asia. However, our queerness was repressed and violently erased by British colonizers who forced us into the closet. Now, in the Canadian diaspora, the descendants of our colonizers refuse to acknowledge our queerness because we're brown. When queer folks folks in general see a woman in a sari just walking around the gay village, or any space for that matter, why is the automatic assumption that this person must be a heterosexual? LGBTQ plus communities in North America speak extensively about sexual liberation, but for who? As a brown woman, I haven't ever in my life been given the agency to define my own sexuality in queer spaces. In fact, our sexuality as queer South Asians is constantly policed by our white counterparts. We're forced to express queerness in very white normative ways, and a failure to do so results in rejection and invisibilization from queer spaces. Even our acquaintances and our colleagues with the best of intentions end up microaggressing us by insisting that we must, come out to our families, because this is what the mainstream LGBTQ plus organizations have convinced us, that, living your truth means publicly declaring your queerness and severing ties with anybody who doesn't accept you. But as queer South Asians, Many of us can't just come out to our families without putting ourselves at risk of family violence. It's not easy to sever ties with the people who immigrated to this country to give us a better life, and it's certainly not an optimal choice given our widespread families and collectivist culture. I'm one of the few LGBTQ+ South Asian activists who has accepted the risk of family violence by engaging in this advocacy work as an openly queer individual for the past 8 years. During this time, I've simultaneously worked to ensure that my parents remain very ignorant to my queerness because I refuse to sacrifice familial ties. This doesn't mean that I'm not out or I'm any less gay. It just means that I'm trying my best to balance both my queer and South Asian identities. And that's just the reality for us. But nonetheless, this risk isn't an option for many others. As such, the profound sense of loneliness that accompanies the queer South Asian experience is amplified during Pride Month. Many queer South Asians are forced to sit at home and during Pride Month due to the risk of being outed by a news broadcast of the event. The inability to find a like community and feel seen has concerning impacts on the mental health of queer South Asians. Our invisibility, coupled with the nearly inexistent resources funneled to LGBTQ+ South Asian organizations, is driving up the suicidal ideation rates of the queer South Asian Canadians. And this is not okay at all. There are several influential people listening to this right now that have a lot of power to keep our community alive and thriving. I strongly encourage everybody listening to this right now to learn more about how you can personally support LGBTQ+ South Asians. If you have the means to do so, it would be great if you could donate to queer South Asian organizations so that we can work to mobilize the resources to help our individual community members survive and thrive. The depth of our exclusion and the grief of our queer South Asian community is too often overlooked. But it's okay. We forgive you for what you didn't know. However, the onus for undoing the damaging effects of colonialism in South Asian culture is on all of you who call yourselves allies. Now that you know better, we expect you to do better. LGBTQ+ South Asians in Canada have been suffering in silence for far too long, and we refuse to endure any more neglect. We're counting on all of you to get LGBTQ+ South Asian diaspora the visibility, the space, and resources that we rightfully deserve. If you'd like to learn more about the Queer South Asian Women's Network, feel free to follow us on @QSAW Network or come find us afterwards. Happy Pride, Shub Pride, Pride Valtukal, and Pride Mubarak.